Welcome to 500 Greatest Songs, a podcast based on Rolling Stone's hugely popular, influential, and sometimes controversial list. I'm Brittany Spanos.
And I'm Rob Sheffield, and we're here to shed light on the greatest songs ever made and discover what makes them so great. And this week's song, Dynamite by BTS.
This is one of two songs by BTS that are on the greatest songs of all time list. They made their debut, of course, in 2021, ranking at number 347 with Dynamite, and then Spring Day landed at number 280. And I mean, BTS was already massive phenomenons at that point, but Dynamite kind of tipped over the edge of BTS mania that would happen globally. I mean, this was their first number one song on the Billboard Hot 100. This was their first fully English language song, and this was the first time an all South Korean group hit number one on the Hot 100. They also broke barriers with the Grammys as well. They got their first Grammy nomination and were also the first South Korean artist to be nominated for a Grammy Award. I mean, it was just kind of a boundary-breaking, massive moment for this band.
Yeah, like Spring Day and Dynamite, kind of a beautiful pair on the list, just because they're sort of opposite extremes of the BTS story. Spring Day is them, like, as the South Korean band. It's a song that was for the hardcore fans, a very emotional, very inspiring song, a very message-oriented song. And Dynamite is after they've become global phenomenon by being exactly themselves, not compromising anything, like that they got so huge in the US, which is so historically resistant to any music not in English, and they just did not cross over to North America. They made North America cross over to them.
Yeah.
And Dynamite, for them to finally do an English language song after they were so massive here on their own terms was just kind of beautiful.
Yeah.
Like, they didn't do it because they had to or because it would get them anything that they didn't already have. Like, they felt like doing this. Yeah,
and the song in particular, too, the timing of it was so much. They released this in August 2020, and this song is like, I mean, it's just like sunshine bottled up into a song. It's like a really great kind of like 70s funk, like very like Bruno Mars, Uptown Funky-esque type of song. It's like really bright and happy. And of course, this was August 2020, not a particularly bright or happy time for anyone around the globe. And I mean, it's very purposeful. They wanted to release a song that was, you know, meant to put a smile on people's faces, bring a little bit of joy and lightness. You know, BTS as songwriters that are coming from a place of talking about being a young person in South Korea who's dealing with kind of the pressures of perfection, or about mental health, or about grief. Spring Day, a perfect example of that. And this was a song that they very intentionally wanted to put out into the world that was kind of countering the amount of grief that people were facing. And it's just kind of a beautiful sentiment. And obviously the song did just that for a lot of people.
Yeah, it really struck a nerve. It would have been so different if they did the song a couple years earlier, you know, when they were still on the rise in this part of the world, where it would have seemed, or in some way it might have been, a sort of compromise to try to broaden their audience. But they did Dynamite when they were already as big as any group could possibly be. Yeah. It was almost a victory lap for them. Yeah. And like you said, that it was at a very bleak global time, and very similar message, very similar emotional impact as Spring Day, but on a just broader global scale.
Yeah, and I mean, like many boy bands before them, you don't really need a number one to tell you that this band is like the biggest in the world, right? Like, this is kind of like the status quo for a lot of like really big kind of global success type of stadium filling boy bands. I mean, like One Direction is a great example of that, where it's like number one hits don't necessarily measure the global impact of a group like this, but BTS had already broken the dam for K-pop globally as a crossover artist, well before the song blew up. And, it's just kind of sort of solidified that in a lot of ways. It sort of just kind of further solidified that legacy of what they had done for K-pop as a genre, for idol groups overall, for that kind of like legacy of that in this particular moment where they can be a crossover success in any capacity.
Yeah. Really wild to also that it came so soon after, the whole Map of the Soul franchise, and just how complex that is. What I think made them like so forbidding and intimidating to people, like when they first started to cross over in this part of the world, was just that they were not what people figured. When people heard the words K-pop or boy band, they had an image of one thing, and like BTS were just so complex in terms of the mythology and in terms of, it's like, they do concept albums about Nietzsche and Carl Jung, and like this is what they do. Like nothing they do is watered down. Yeah. So for them to do Dynamite, a very simple, accessible, across the board, anybody hearing this could like it at first listen, just a real statement in itself.
Yeah, and I mean, with Dynamite, with this kind of like further breakthrough post Map of the Soul, everything that was going on. I mean, of course, like Map of the Soul was already massive in its own right. They were a decade in at this point since they had first formed, and 7 years since they made their debut. But I love kind of like the origin of RM being this like underground rapper and like this big hit wanting to create a hip hop group around him. So Suga and J-Hope were the first ones recruited, and eventually kind of decided to pivot to an idol group, and were having like struggling getting people to audition to be part of an idol group. I mean, now Big Hit Entertainment is like one of the biggest names in K-pop globally. I mean, just in pop music globally, and we're kind of, a very lesser known label at that point. But yeah, eventually formed a group in 2010, spent 3 years training. They were like living together. They were spending like 15 hours a day training and practicing to become this like powerhouse group. I mean, you can tell in like every single one of the performances, like they are just like incredibly talented, each of them. And, in 2013 made their debut and, started releasing music under Big Hit, and obviously have become one of the biggest bands in history.
Yeah. And did it by playing up their weirdness. I mean, it is funny, especially when they started to like make inroads here where, there's real resistance to boy bands. People like never really appreciate them. The whole tradition and legacy is that they have this pop audience that they start with, and other audiences are really threatened by that. Yeah. I know the memory is similar for you, but when one of the first times that they were on one of the American late night chat shows, and there was this funny idea of like, we'll dress them up as the Beatles, playing Ed Sullivan. Doesn't hold up great with time now. But even at that time seemed like really like uncomprehending of how original they were. And the idea that the only way Americans could appreciate this was by channeling it through something that they already knew. That was, from England. And got it completely backwards, because BTS became a stadium band here just by being themselves. And honestly, they didn't have any songs that sounded like the Beatles. Yeah. And they weren't like the Beatles. They were their own kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, especially with K-pop idol groups. I mean, they've existed for a very long time, and these groups have always been very, very successful and massive in a lot of ways, in a lot of markets, obviously. There was very little breakthrough in the American market until BTS. I mean, other than, Psy blowing up and becoming kind of like this viral, like meme sort of artist and song with Gangnam Style. But I mean, BTS was that kind of like really important artist and group that like really helped kind of show for a lot of like American industry experts and people who are like paying attention to really great pop music that this was like a massive global success and something worth paying attention to, and bigger than our previously seen kind of quantifiable ways of measuring success.
That's such a brilliant way to put it. They were just outside any model that people could use, and certainly like going back in time to when they were first making records, it would have been easy for any American expert in the music business to say what they should do if they want to be popular here. It's like, okay, first you have to do some songs in English. You have to do duets with very famous American stars who have fallen on hard times, which is why they're doing this kind of duet. You need to pick some members of the group and make them the front people. You need to really limit what they do so it's very understandable and accessible. And it's almost like they anticipated that advice and did the exact opposite of all that stuff. And that their story couldn't have happened if they'd tried to compromise in any way.
Yeah, and I mean, it's such a great story of kind of the power of fandom. I mean, this is just like a band that is very close with the BTS army, with their fans, like has kind of, just organically built this like really worldwide network of people who love them and kind of appreciate the fact that they exist in this way where they have their personalities. They each have like their strengths, and we're seeing this now with their solo releases that they're rolling out. I mean, there's so much talent kind of locked into this group. Like people just could not had not seen something like that before.
Yeah. It was funny that in terms of like Dynamite being them, it couldn't have been Dynamite if they'd done it as a step up into the English language or American market. It was really something that only became the triumph it became because they did it after they didn't need that move anymore. Like their duet with Megan, they didn't do that to get more popular.
Yeah.
Like they did that because they were so popular and because they had such a fascinating combination with Megan.
Yeah.
I mean, that record is just so unique for both of them. Like they did not need to meet each other in the middle, and they didn't. Yeah,
and even with Dynamite, I mean, this is like one of the first songs that none of them had a hand in writing too. Like they've been writing their own music since they were, kids. Like that they've been doing this the entire time. It's like also, especially given how part of the success of BTS is kind of they were writing from this place of this like very real. They have like the school series where they're talking about their experiences as teens, and they're translating that to their music and kind of what they were going through. And that's always been such an important part of their success and of their music. And I mean, I think we talk about that all the time with so many artists who start really young is like what draws in those fans and what draws in people caring about them is them just kind of relaying that experience of being young and what it's like to a new generation of people who are young and trying to make sense of the world. And that's exactly what BTS was doing for their fans from the time they broke and from the time they debuted.
Yeah. You made such a crucial point about them in terms of their evolution that this happens after the internet has created a new kind of fan community, fan culture that exists independent of the conventional music industry so that they could really do an end run around the conventional industry just because it was so suddenly so accessible for people around the world from all different cultures, all different generations, all different languages, all different styles of music, so accessible for people to find that music and make their own connection to it.
Yeah, and I think like it's always, interesting talking with people about kind of like what those origins of really like massive sort of fan networks online were. And I think everyone sort of has different answers, right? Because I mean, like, there's like, people think about Lil Monsters and like how they function online. But like, in comparison to like One Direction, right? Like, the Lil Monsters were less involved with like the success of Lady Gaga as like, Directioners were involved with the success of One Direction. But, like I mentioned earlier, like it's so much like K-pop fandom existing online because this was like that kind of global connection that feels so much to me like the defining aspect of how internet fandoms formed and how they work on, from different chat rooms and, kind of nascent version of ways people talk to each other online to like Tumblr and MySpace and Twitter now and TikTok and all of that. That feels like that origin and sort of that kind of natural progression of making an act like BTS become as big as they have become.
Absolutely. And boy, like what you said about the ARMY, like being part of the group is so true. And that's such a long tradition for boy bands. And yet, they always have this song that's about, the fans. They always have the tribute. They always know that the audience is there. And they've all got the classic song that's, they're larger than life. They're, like, Thank You Girl. There's their song that's directly to the audience. And the BTS just made such a tradition of that in itself. So many great love songs that come on when you go through them as conventional love songs, but they're heard and meant to be heard as songs between the boys and their audience.
Yeah, and I'm curious, like, do you think that Dynamite will be that, like, I want it that way for BTS? Like, or do you see another song, or maybe we haven't heard that song yet, but do you think that this will become that song for them, or do you have another one that you feel stands out in that way?
Wow. It's interesting what you say. We don't know if Dynamite is going to go down in history as the one. It's funny, like Dynamite is one that just, it stands out as a highlight, but I don't know if it'll go down in history as, the highlight of this phase at least.
Yeah, and I mean, just even like the timing, of course in 2022, all the members ended up having to put this on pause so that they can do their 18 months of mandatory military service in South Korea. They're all kind of doing it at different times and obviously depending on age and kind of going in order of that. So they've been slowly rolling out solo albums, which have also done extremely well and been really like massive successes for them. So I am curious kind of what happens in 2025, which is when they said they would end up returning to the group and releasing more music and what that will look like. I trust them more than other boy bands that have said that they're on hiatus. So I'm gonna believe that they're, they will come back together, because it did feel like it was just a kind of a new beginning for them as a group.
Yeah, and this was always a hiatus that had a particular purpose.
Yeah.
And they knew this was coming. This is part of like a long-term planning for them. It didn't come by surprise.
Yeah, obviously strategy can't tell you like how big a band will get, like no matter how well you're strategizing, but they knew it was coming. It just so happened that they were one of the best-selling acts in the world.
Yes.
At the time that it happened.
Yeah. For something like Dynamite, and when it came at a time when they didn't have to work through conventional North American media. I think a lot of us associate Dynamite with when they were on the Grammys doing Dynamite, and it was a first for them to be doing one of their songs on the Grammys. They were on, the year before doing Soul Town Road, which was, a phenomenal 10-second moment in the Grammys. But
God, I almost completely forgot about that. That was such a good moment.
It was such a great moment.
And next up, we will be joined by Michelle Kim, who is a freelance editor and writer whose work has appeared in Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, Teen Vogue, The Guardian, and much more. We are joined now by Michelle Kim, who is an amazing freelance writer and editor who's written for Rolling Stone and numerous other outlets. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
I'm very excited.
So, tell us a little bit about the origins of both your BTS fandom and also covering them.
Yes. So honestly, I have sort of a maybe complicated relationship with K-pop, or I did have growing up, because I was super into it in middle school, was super into Big Bang. That was like my original group, if you will. But then as I kind of got older, I didn't really know if I wanted to keep on listening to this Korean music, because I didn't know if I wanted to fit in more within like my American school. And whenever I listened to Korean music, I felt kind of alienated from it. So I knew of BTS and I kept up with their singles. I had friends who liked them. So I knew them as they were kind of rising from, I would say, like 2017 when DNA got really big. And then in the pandemic, everything sort of blew up with Dynamite. And that was also a time when we were all isolated. I was kind of looking inwards myself and trying to figure out like what's going on. And I think BTS was actually like a really important part of me like taking Korean classes for the first time, like connecting back to my heritage. And just because there was so much content, I kind of just like fell into this K-pop hole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, from your perspective too, of being a young fan of, a lot of idol groups and artists, like what was sort of that development of the popularity of Korean music in the US, or kind of especially leading up to BTS breaking through and kind of building sort of even more success in the US and allowing, I guess like more recognition for a lot of other artists from South Korea. But I'm curious like what your perspective is of especially the online fandom portion of it.
Yes. Yeah. So I would say growing up, it was pretty niche to like K-pop. And I would say that there were some sort of like enclaves of communities, probably more on the West Coast in California, that like were super into it as a niche thing that they liked. But I grew up on the East Coast, so like fandom was pretty fragmented for me. And there was just some songs that like me and my brother listened to only from what it felt like for me. But during the pandemic, like I said, since everyone was inside looking for an escape from their dreary, like just waking up in your own house every day, I think that because K-pop produces so much content around the music itself, whether that's music videos, behind the scenes footage, and them goofing around, and also just a lot of idol groups making what they call variety content, which is just them like playing games with each other like you would see on a variety show. And I think BTS actually kind of kicked off this huge trend of idols doing that sort of content, because they started their Run BTS series, I think in 2015, where they just would hang out, play games. It was super funny. You got to see the members' personalities outside of their very serious stage persona. And I think at that time, during the pandemic, a lot of people started watching that show, watching their YouTube video. They have behind the scenes content called Bangtan Bombs, which are just them being backstage, goofing around. And I think just the fact that people could watch so much minutia of someone else's daily life that wasn't their own, like the fandom really blew up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, what is it about them in particular? I mean, the personality is obviously such a big part of it. They all are just like so charismatic and so just like kind of energy personified in like both their performances and also what we see off stage. But I mean, obviously the music is, I mean, just the way it's developed over the last, I guess, like decade of them being a public band. Like, what is it about that chemistry that they have as a group that made them break through in the way that they have, even before Dynamite being their first fully English language single? I mean, what was it about them in particular?
The origin of BTS was a pretty unusual one in terms of 3 of the members were sort of part of these like street hip hop circles, like, and were already sort of performing or writing raps and producing before they became idols. So I'm talking about RM. He was writing raps and releasing music before he was training at Big Hit Entertainment. Suga was also rapping and producing, and then J-Hope was part of like a street dance crew. What it seems like is that Big Hit at the time, they wanted to really create this more hip-hop leaning group that they could take the talents that these members had already developed and then maybe match them with more idolish members, which they would then scout, and then put together this pretty unique format for a boy group. And like after their debut, the chairman of their company even said, like, convince them to join, like, become an idol, become part of this group by saying you won't have to learn complicated choreography. It won't be that kind of group. It'll be a hip hop group. And then they joined and they were like, oh, you lied to us. So they've talked about that openly. But all that is to say is that the songwriting is super strong because I think RM and Suga, they have been really the backbone of the songwriting, and they're just very analytical but also poetic sort of writers in their own ways. And I think having that foundation, but then also having other producers and songwriters kind of making them into catchy hits. And then as they debuted and went from more like hip hop sounding to like more synth pop, electro pop, to the bubblegum pop that they eventually made, I think that's sort of where it all like came together, where fans noticed that there was a lot of interesting lyricism and songwriting to grab onto, but then they could also have the very like catchy, fun moments as well.
Nice.
I'm curious because we were talking about Map of the Soul and its place in their story and in their mythology. And and like you said, this kind of world building that they've done.
Totally. I do know that like world building was an extremely important part of just cultivating that fandom. Like I said, people really like to grab onto storylines that have nothing to do with them, that exist in a fantasy land outside of them. And because, like I said, RM is super like into literature and like looking up different like psychology terms, they took Freudian and Jungian language to build out this like universe of pop music.
Yeah.
That's what I can say about it.
I mean, the 2 songs that are on the list, Spring Day and Dynamite, really tell 2 very distinct sides of the BTS story. And I want to talk about Spring Day a little bit, about the significance.
Spring Day is one of my favorite, personally my favorite BTS songs. It is one of my go-to karaoke songs. I think the lyrics are so beautiful. They're basically in this category of BTS music that I like to just call yearning music, which is they're expressing when will I see you again, and using this imagery of like snowflakes falling, but also like blossoms falling, to convey this passage of like from the transition between winter to spring and waiting for this person to come back to their life or seeing them again in this sort of like ethereal otherworldly way. I don't know, that's how I see the song. So at its core it's a ballad, but there is a lot of this like electro synth production underneath that kind of pushes it through. And then, like I said, like RM and Suga like bringing in their raps that make it a little bit more unique and break up the structure of the song. It has become sort of this interesting piece of culture within South Korean mainstream culture because the song has been tied to the Seoul ferry tragedy, where unfortunately there was this horrible event where these elementary schoolers were taken on a field trip to go on a ferry, and something happened with the boat that ended up in this like mass death. For a long time, that song was linked to that event unofficially because the lyrics kind of convey this sadness and longing of, I will never be able to see you again. And then I think a couple years ago, they've kind of semi-confirmed in interviews that they're comfortable with that song being tied to that event. And I'm not sure exactly if it was written in response to the event, but it seems like they are okay with people thinking that it's connected.
Yeah. I mean, there is so much beauty connecting it to the purpose of Dynamite being released when it was and being released mid-pandemic and meant to be this kind of like light to their fans and to their listeners, which ended up going beyond, of course, the core fandom and finding such like a massive audience. I mean, how do you kind of envision what Dynamite started to begin for this new chapter for BTS's career and leading to a string of big hits from them and also kind of the widening of their fan base?
Definitely. I think Dynamite is such a pivotal point where there is such a clear before and after. They have talked in interviews about the fact that they were promoting their single On for Map of the Soul in February 2020 and had to like cancel in the middle of promotions, was going to go on this whole world tour and had to cancel all of that, regroup and figure out what their next direction is. And Dynamite was the next direction, and it really like skyrocketed them at a time when people really needed escapism, like energetic music. I think disco was like kind of in the ether that year with like Doja Cat and Dua Lipa, or in that era, I mean. And I think I pulled a quote from RM who said like in the video where they announced that they would like focus on their solo projects, he said like, I didn't know what we would do after On, but then COVID came up. So we did Dynamite, Butter, Permission to Dance, Life Goes On. And I realized the group has definitely changed. We have to accept that we've changed. For me, it was like the group BTS was within my grasp until On and Dynamite. But then after Butter and Permission to Dance, I didn't know what kind of group we were anymore. What I get from that is that they didn't really realize that Dynamite was going to get so big, and they were just trying something. I think they were trying a lot of new things, where it was a song where the group members like didn't participate in songwriting, which was very rare for them. They got some, I believe, American songwriters to co-write a song, and then they just sang it. And it was also, what's kind of unusual for the song is that all the vocal lines for the members are all pretty much the same. Like they all get like a couple verses here and there, but it's not like RM and Suga and J-Hope are rapping and then like there's a specific like bridge or something for Jungkook. Like all of them kind of get a similar melody. And I think that was unusual at the time because it was more of a straightforward pop song that they were just like, okay, we'll sing it. And so what RM was kind of saying about like losing, not being able to grasp the group's identity anymore is that they made Dynamite, it blew up, and then I think the company tried to recreate that magic with Butter, which I think they did successfully. I love Butter personally. Yeah. But then there was like this expectation to either continue that sort of standard pop music, or would they go back to the sort of creative, very BTS music that they made before.
Yeah.
So, wow.
And I mean, they've all rolled out solo albums at this point since they've been on their hiatus for military service. And I'm curious, like, in that identity sense, like, what do those solo albums say about where the members of BTS are now creatively?
Yes. I think I kind of hinted before, but I think also a magic of BTS is that all of the members are so different. They have all such different personalities. They all have such different tastes in music. They express themselves in completely different ways. And that's not the case with all K-pop groups. Sometimes companies make groups where they want the members to be somewhat similar or want them to have a certain vibe. And with BTS, I feel like they really wanted people who were all different and unique. And it feels like Big Hit helped foster that uniqueness, even if they did have to come together as a group. And so I see the solo albums as each of the members really trying to like challenge themselves to make their unique statement, make the music that they couldn't make before. For RM, that means making very like experimental indie folk to indie rock to like electronic R&B and like kind of going all over the place. That's what he did with Indigo. With J-Hope, that means making this like really intense trap music, and so on and so forth.
You've written so powerfully about Spring Day and about the sort of the emotional history of that song and its place in their legacy and in their story. I guess we were talking about different songs that represent different sort of moments in their history, and you talked about the category of yearning songs.
Oh yeah.
And okay, I'm curious what other categories you have in mind when you think about their music.
In terms of BTS categories, I would say there's the really like hard-hitting hip-hop songs where they're just going in with their lyricism and like portraying like a super cool like rap persona. So there's songs like Oog, their Cypher series. I love that category as well. And I would also say they have songs that are about like the power of friendship and like loving each other, which I think is also very appealing to fans because they like seeing like idols interact in terms of like seeing like platonic intimacy in a way. And so those songs are also really tender and wonderful. Yeah, and there's also some songs that are more like social commentary, more speaking from the perspective of youth and teenagers. And so one of my other favorites is this song called Silver Spoon, which is just kind of talking to older generations being like, why do you keep on telling us to work harder when society is not set up to help us out? And so there's a lot of different categories with them, which I think has helped their success a lot.
And finally, to sort of broaden out and to think about the future of a list like the 500 Greatest Songs of All Time list, of course, what do you kind of envision in the future, like maybe a future kind of like a decade from now of like what songs you'd like to see on the list beyond, of course, BTS, if there are, of course, BTS songs that you think should make a future version of the list, but artists or songs that should be represented in the future that's had a big impact both on K-pop and pop music generally.
Yes, definitely. The first artist that came to mind was maybe a New Jeans song because I think they've had such a strong impact on not only the K-pop landscape, a lot of aesthetics kind of followed since their debut. So perhaps New Jeans, but I think it would be really interesting to like go back and look at sort of the more seminal K-pop songs and like see if those have a place in the list. I helped like make the 100 best songs in the history of Korean pop music list for Rolling Stone, and our number one was G by Girls' Generation, which is just such a like sugar bomb of a song. And I think that we really tried to recognize that song as like there is a place for cuteness and loveliness in pop music, and K-pop girl groups really nail it. And so I'm wondering if there can be more of those vibes on the list as well.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
course.
Thanks so much for listening to Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Songs. This podcast is brought to you by Rolling Stone and iHeartMedia. Written and hosted by me, Brittany Spanos, and Rob Sheffield. Executive produced by Gus Wenner, Jason Fine, Alex Dale, and Christian Horde. And produced by Jesse Cannon with music supervision by Eric Seiler.